At the very outset, a very warm welcome to all of you. This is Dr. Manisha Mirdha, and today we would be speaking on deliberative democracy. This topic has been divided into two parts, and let's begin with the first part of this topic. To initiate the discussion, let us first try to understand what is deliberative democracy. Deliberative democracy, or what it is also called as discursive democracy, is a form of democracy in which deliberation is central to decision making. Deliberative democracy differs from traditional democratic theory in that authentic deliberation, not merely voting, is the primary source of legitimacy for the law. Deliberative democracy is closely related to consultative democracy, in which public consultation with citizens is central to the democratic process. So, by now we have understood what democracy is, and we call it the rule of the people, or what in political terms would be called the popular will. And deliberation is basically a dialogue with emphasis on the logic of reason. So, keeping this in mind, let us proceed by trying to understand what are the key tenets of democracy. Deliberative democracy is a system in which decision making is based on thoughtful and inclusive discussions among citizens, aiming to reach consensus or reasonable agreements through open and informed dialogue. So, let us try to understand some of the major postulates of this concept of democracy. To begin with, public deliberation. Central to deliberative democracy is the idea that citizens engage in reasoned discussions about public issues, policies and decisions. This involves listening to diverse viewpoints, critically evaluating arguments and participating in respectful dialogue. So, one of the basic factors that have to be kept in mind about deliberative democracy is that it is something which involves a very enlightening and insightful decision making without any emphasis on irrelevant factors. Another factor for deliberative democracy is inclusivity. Deliberative democracy promotes the inclusion of a wide range of citizens in decision making process, striving to ensure that marginalized and underrepresented voices are heard. This contrasts with traditional forms of representative democracy, where elected officials make decisions on behalf of the people. So, one of the major factors of this kind of democracy, and which also differentiates it from the representative democracy that we have already read about, is that all the citizens directly participate in the decision making process, irrespective of what strata that they might belong to, what kind of literacy level they might belong to, and what kind of religion, caste or creed they belong to. So, it is a very representative selection of people from all diverse angles of the society. Next, we move on to the third point, which is reasoned decision making. The focus of deliberative democracy is on making decisions that are well justified, rational and well informed. This is in contrast to other democratic models, where decisions might be based on emotions, short term interests or media manipulation. So, this kind of deliberation is free of any kind of trivia, any kind of jargon, and is something which is also away from the manipulation of the media. So, this is something which is very objective deliberation. Public discourse and media. Deliberative democracy places importance on the role of media and public discourse. A well informed and vibrant public sphere is seen as essential for fostering informed deliberation amongst citizens. So, we just said that the harmful impact of media is something which is kept aside from, but nevertheless media as the fourth pillar of democracy is completely recognized and is influential in the decision making process, and this is something which eventually moves towards informed deliberation amongst the citizens. Citizen participation. Citizens are considered active participants in decision making processes rather than passive recipients of decisions made by representatives. Deliberative processes can involve citizen assemblies, public forums, town hall meetings, online platforms and more. So, citizens are considered to be very active members of the entire deliberation process which goes on, And examples of such deliberative forums could be something like citizens' assemblies or the kind of town hall meetings which are there for this purpose. Consensus and compromise. While deliberative democracy aims for consensus or broad agreement, it recognizes that complete consensus may not always be achievable. In such cases, the process encourages findings and compromises that take into account various perspectives. So, this kind of deliberation does not necessarily start with this premise that a consensus has to be reached. Rather, the intention is to come up with the best decision. Eventually, they might come up with a compromise, but consensus is not a necessary prerequisite of such a kind of a deliberation. Civic education. A successful deliberative democracy requires an educated citizenry capable of understanding complex issues, critically evaluating the arguments and engaging in constructive dialogue. Civic education is seen as crucial to fostering these skills. So, this kind of democracy also assumes that the participants or the stakeholders are going to be informed and participative members of the group. People who are not participative or not engaged in the processes of deliberation will never be an asset to this kind of a deliberation. Ethical considerations. Deliberative democracy emphasizes ethical principles such as respect, openness and fairness. It seeks to create an environment where participants feel safe expressing their views and where decisions are made transparently. So, this is a very important aspect of such a kind of democracy, though it is very difficult to fulfill this condition, but this assumes that this kind of a deliberation will be shorn of any kind of discrimination. People are considered on the same footing. All the members who are participating in this deliberation should feel safe and secure while expressing their opinions. Implementation. Deliberative democracy can be implemented at various levels, from local to national, and can be applied to a wide range of issues from policy making to constitutional reforms. So, this means that this kind of a deliberation can occur at all the levels of governance. It could be local, state level, national or maybe international, and this is something which will affect the policies and the constitutional mandates also. So, this has a very important purpose to serve, and therefore, inputs are required from all the forums of the populace. Deliberative democracy faces challenges such as time constraints, the potential for dominance by articulate and powerful participants, and the difficulty of achieving true inclusivity. Critics also point out that it might not be practical for all decision making processes. So, critics point out that the decision making which actually occurs over here is critical in the sense because that might be influenced by factors which will not be very conducive towards the decision making process. Some real world examples of deliberative democracy include citizens' assemblies in Ireland to discuss constitutional issues, participatory budgeting processes in various countries, and online platforms for public discussions in governmental policies. These are some of the examples, and a very good example of this is also, which we would be talking about eventually, is the Gram Sabha in our own country. That again is a very clear and a very good example of deliberative democracy. So, with whatever that we have spoken till now, we could understand that deliberative democracy is something which refers to citizens' preferences and should be shaped by deliberation in advance of the decision making rather than by self-interest. With respect to individual and collective citizen decision making, deliberative democracy shifts the emphasis from the outcome of the decision to the quality of the process. So, the mission over here is not the outcome. They are mostly governed by the process itself and try to enhance the process by bringing in reasonable, rational and inclusive decision making. Deliberation in democratic processes generates outcomes that secure the public or common good through reason rather than through political power. So, it is not political power which should decide the kind of deliberation which goes on, rather it should be the vision of the people and the desires of the people which would decide the deliberation process. Deliberative democracy is based not on a competition between conflicting interests, but on an exchange of information and justifications supporting varying perspectives on the public good. So, the eventual mission is public welfare, public good. The idea is not to bring out a forum where conflict of interest gets a way to deliberate upon. Now, let us also try to understand when did this entire concept of deliberative democracy actually got started. The idea was possibly initiated in the mid 20th century, and most political scientists presumed that individuals and organizations wanted things. Now, what were these things that people wanted? People made political choices to get as much of what they wanted as possible. But the clarity over here is not on what people actually wanted. So, for instance, citizens in a democracy voted for what they wanted. Harold Laswell's famous textbook, which was titled as Who Gets What, When and How, is the first book which actually talks about this idea. However, the true form of understanding of deliberative democracy starts somewhere around 1970s. So, around this time it became increasingly influential and growing into a dominant paradigm for political theory. Two of the early influences on deliberative democratic theory are the philosophers John Rawls and Jürgen Habermas. John Rawls actually was an American political scientist who belonged to the tradition of liberal theory, and Habermas is a German philosopher who belongs to the tradition of critical theory and pragmatism. So, Rawls advocated the use of reason in securing the framework for a just political society, and Habermas claims that fair procedures and clear communication can produce legitimate and consensual decisions by citizens. These fair procedures governing the deliberative process are what legitimates the outcome. So, Rawls, as we can see, is referring to the concept of reason and as the very essential aspect for a just political society, whereas Habermas is someone who talks about fair procedures and fair institutions which are required for the legitimate outcome of a democracy. If we try to look into some of the features of deliberation, to begin with, deliberative theorists tend to argue that publicity is a necessary feature of legitimate democratic processes. So, as we have earlier also said, this is a process which completely talks only about the public domain. It is something which argues that it is very important that the public domain, which would lead to a legitimate democratic process, is brought about by the inclusive deliberation of all the populace. First, issues within a democracy should be public and should be publicly debated. Whatever issue which concerns the public domain is something which should come out in the open and should be publicly debated by people who are going to be influenced by this. Second, processes within democratic institutions must be public and subject to public scrutiny. So, not just the issues, but the processes and the institutions where this takes place should also be completely under public scrutiny, and public has the authority to question the officials on this. Finally, in addition to being provided with information, citizens need to ensure the use of a public form of reason to ground political decisions rather than rely on abstract or sublime sources of authority available only to a select segment of the society. So, this is something which should not only be possible for a select few. which could be the wealthy, which could be people belonging to particular religions. It is something which is available or should be available to people of the country, all the people of the country. Deliberative democrats argue that we should not be satisfied when individuals and groups try to get what they want. People may not want good things, their power is starkly unequal, and some of their tactics are unethical. Besides, people often do not know what they want until they have communicated with others. So, this says that the contention of this kind of democracy is not what people actually want, because what they want is something which is arising from their personal experiences. But personal experiences might always not be the best way to decide the best outcomes, and it is something which can come only out of discussions. It is something which can come only out of a dialogue and when we listen to others. So, what it wants is that people should first of all know what is good for them to decide what they actually want. Now, we would be looking into some of the models. There are certain models which also talk about this kind of a democracy, and let us look into these models and what they talk about and how they explain deliberative democracy. To begin with, I start with James Fishkin, who has designed practical implementations of deliberative democracy through deliberative polling for over 15 years in various countries, and has given 5 characteristics which actually legitimize deliberation. To begin with, information. The extent to which participants are given access to reasonably accurate information that they believe to be relevant to the issue. So, what Fishkin believes is that it is a very necessary prerequisite that the people who are participating in the deliberation are given all the necessary information. Without this prerequisite, the aim of the deliberation might not be fulfilled. So, therefore, for all aspects of deliberation, reasonably accurate information has to be delivered to all the participants. Substantive balance. The extent to which arguments offered by one side or from one perspective are answered by considerations offered by those who hold other perspectives. So, there has to be a mutual respect, there has to be a mutual understanding of the ideas, and there should be a fair balance of ideas coming from both the sides. So, this again, a substantive balance again becomes a essential prerequisite for this kind of a democracy. Then we move on to diversity. The extent to which the major position in the public are represented by participants in the discussion. So, Fishkin also clearly points out that it is essential for deliberative democracy to be successful that you have a very diverse group, a heterogeneous group from all the sections of the society, because that is the only way through which democracy can come up with outcomes which would be beneficial for all. Proceeding further, Fishkin also talks about the extent to which participants sincerely weigh the merits of the arguments. So, along with the information which he has mentioned, it is equally important that the people should have, the participants or the people who are into this deliberation should be able to weigh the merits of the arguments, should be able to weigh the good points and the lacunas of the argument for them to proceed further and for them to come up with the best possible decisions. An equal consideration lastly he talks about, which is that the extent to which arguments offered by all participants are considered on the merits regardless of which participant offers them. So, it has to be very clearly understood by all the members that all the views given, all the advices given by the members and by all the members are equally important. There should not be created an hierarchy within the group, because that would completely defeat the purpose of deliberation. Then there is another model which is Cohen's outline, which we will also speak about, and which tells us about what deliberative democracy is. Cohen was actually also a student of John Rawls. Joshua Cohen argues that the 5 main features of deliberative democracy includes: the first one, an ongoing independent association with expected continuation. The citizens in the democracy structure their institutions such that deliberation is the deciding factor in the creation of the institutions, and the institutions allow deliberations to continue. So, what he is trying to say is that the institutions should succumb to the logic of reason. The institutions and the structures are created in such a way that they promote deliberation. A commitment to the respect of a pluralism of values and aims within the polity. So, a very multivariate, multicultural understanding of deliberation has to be clear from the onset of the deliberation, and all the members have to be committed. They have to respect this pluralist view of ideas and values and beliefs which is coming. It is a spectrum of ideas which has been inculcated for the benefit of the deliberation. The citizens consider deliberative procedure as the source of legitimacy and prefer each law to be transparent and easily traceable to the deliberative process. Citizens have to be very sure of what they actually propose, because eventually this is something which is going to lay down the laws for the land. Each member recognizes and respects other members' deliberative capacity. So, in continuation of what we have spoken before, a mutual respect, a mutual understanding and a commitment towards the merit of each argument being proposed in the deliberation has to be there. And lastly, one more model that we talk about, which is Gutman and Thompson's model. They have defined democracy as a form of government. They have defined deliberative democracy as a form of government in which free and equal citizens and their representatives justify decisions in a process in which they give one another reasons that are mutually acceptable and generally accessible, with all the aim of reaching decisions that are binding on all at present, but open to challenge in the future. So, another important aspect of deliberation, that it is not that once a decision which has been taken is there to stay for a lifetime, because we live in a very dynamic world. Things will change, minds will evolve and everything will grow eventually. What worked yesterday might not work tomorrow. So, therefore, this kind of understanding has to be also there, that decisions taken today are prone to modifications tomorrow. They state that deliberative democracy has 4 requirements which refer to the kind of reasons that citizens and their representatives are expected to give to one another. Reciprocal, the reasons should be acceptable to free and equal persons seeking fair terms of cooperation. So, reciprocity is respected. Accessible, the reasons must be given in public and the content must be understandable to the relevant audience. It has to come down to a level which is clear and cognizable to the entire forum sitting over there. Binding, the reason giving process leads to a decision or law, is enforced for some period of time at least. So, the participants do not deliberate just for the sake of deliberation or for individual enlightenment. A very deep and clear understanding has to be there, that whatever that they deliberate upon and whatever that they eventually propose to the government will have policy implications and will have a binding impact on the people of the country. Say for example, if you talk about COVID times, so it was something where there was no precedent to that. There might have been various deliberations, and then the consequences of the deliberations were that we had various lockdowns. We had lockdown 1, 2 and thereby various others, because it did impact the lives of various people. So, deliberations which happen in any such forum has to be very clearly understood that it is going to impact the lives and the lives of the families also. dynamic or provisional. The participants must keep open the possibility of changing their minds and continuing a reason-giving dialogue that can challenge previous decisions and laws. So, people have the right to challenge the other view which possibly was prevailing till now, and they also have a right to question their own view which was initially found to be substantial, but with the changing times they can deliberate and question their own proposals. So, these are the three models that we have spoken of which give us an idea of what deliberative democracy generally embarks upon. Having said this, we should also look at a few challenges which are inherent to the idea of deliberative democracy. Many theorists consider the following possible problems with the theories of deliberative democracy. If only certain modes of expression or forms of argument and cultural styles are publicly acceptable, then the voices of certain citizens will be excluded. This exclusion will diminish the quality and the legitimacy of the outcome of deliberative process. So, it has to be very clearly understood in the minds of the people that they have to be active listeners to all kinds of opinions being presented. If again, as I said previously, there are hierarchical structures which are created while the presentation of proposals are there, then the purpose is defeated. Voices of all the citizens, voices of all the people of the country, to whichever socio-economic strata they might belong to, or whatever religion that they might belong to, or even whatever literacy level that they might belong to, has to be paid heed to. Further, deliberation assumes the capacity of citizens to be reasonable, cooperate, unify and shape their views based on rational debate and views of others. So, this seems simple, but it is a very difficult task to be achieved, because to assume human beings to be completely rational always is a very difficult job. So, therefore, to assume that they would always cooperate and they would unify and accordingly their views would be shaped is again another difficult challenge. Social conditions such as already existing structural inequalities, pluralism, social complexities, the increasing scope of political concerns and the impracticality of affected citizens have forums in which to deliberate are also reasons why some are skeptical of the viability of a deliberative form of democracy. So, whatever challenges that we have spoken of does pose question to the idea of deliberative democracy in spite of its high relevance. I would like to conclude by a kind of definition which has been given by Peter Levine, which kind of also wraps up the idea of deliberative democracy, and to read this out: a deliberative democracy is a system in which people discuss before they make decisions. In order for the system to be democratic, people must have reasonably equal power over decisions, which usually means that they each have one vote. In order for the discussions to qualify as deliberative, the communication must also meet certain criteria. The precise criteria are debated because there is no one consensus on this, but typically it includes equitable participation, lack of coercion and censorship, and interactions amongst people who disagree. Some would include civility, but that is something that we will include when we come to the part 2 of this module. So, I would just quickly summarize of what we have spoken of till now. We started with what deliberative democracy means. We dealt with the key tenets of deliberative democracy. After that, we dealt with the features of deliberative democracy and the three models of deliberative democracy which have been spoken of. We wrapped up the discussion with the challenges on the concept and thereby with the conclusion. That is all for today. We will be coming up again with this part 2 of this topic. Thank you.